In this video, I will discuss an experiment involving simple distillation where the mixture to be separated is a mixture of copper 2 sulfate and water, where copper 2 sulfate is a solute and water is the solvent. In this experiment, which is simple distillation, the aim would be to obtain the solvent, which is water, but coincidentally, in this experiment, we can also obtain the solute, which is copper 2 sulfate. Let's talk about the observations that we would expect during this experiment. And as I list the observations, I will also discuss what the observations mean. Before I do, let us note that observations will include what is seen, what is heard, and any gases we may smell or which may be evolved during the process. So let's start with the first observation, which is pertinent in that the copper 2 sulfate solution, which is placed in the distillation flask, would be blue. As that mixture of copper 2 sulfate and water is heated, boiling will occur where the liquid water is converted into water vapor. The water vapor will travel upwards. It will then enter the condenser. During this process of boiling, and we would only define the process as boiling in the discussion, we would first have to make the observation that during heating there would have been an uneven bubbling of the mixture or rapid bubbling. Right, so uneven or rapid bubbling of the mixture. As the water vapor is formed, it will enter into the condenser. During that time, we would expect that the reading on the thermometer to be 100 degrees Celsius as this pure water vapor enters the condenser. The water vapor which enters the condenser will then be cooled and condensed into liquid water. How would we know? We would see a colorless liquid dripping into the receiver. So in our discussion, we would identify what is the name of the colorless liquid. We would not do so in observation, right? So observations are what do we see, hear, smell, etc. So our water vapor will condense into liquid water that drips into the receiver. We would call the liquid obtained the distillate. Right, so boiling and condensation having occurred and we've obtained our distillate, there's another observation to be noted, which is that the solution left behind in the distillation flask would be a color of a deep blue color, and this is because it's a saturated solution, as most of the water would have been boiled and condensed, and we would not heat until all the water boils away as this would cause our copper 2 sulfate to decompose. Now, copper 2 sulfate is a solid which decomposes on heating, and this is why the process by which to obtain it is called crystallization. We would take our saturated solution of copper 2 sulfate. We would have to filter to get the anti-bumping granules out of the solution. Our filtrate that we obtain looks deep blue. We would then take our filtrate, leave it in the evaporating dish, and allow the evaporating dish to cool. Sorry, the saturated solution in the evaporating dish to cool, such that on cooling, blue crystals would be obtained. And there are two photos on the right which shows the blue crystals, that is the hydrated copper 2 sulfate crystals which are obtained. After having looked at our observations, we would write a discussion. The discussion involves explaining all the observations. In this discussion, we will also include the equation seen on the screen, which shows that saturated copper 2 sulfate solution, which when allowed to cool overnight through a process of crystallization, the hydrated copper 2 sulfate crystals will form. You're going to see the formula for hydrated copper 2 sulfate. You have to learn off this formula where it shows what is meant by a hydrated salt. And the hydrated salt shows 5 water molecules which are bound together with this copper sulfate. And this is why the crystal has such a lovely color. You're also going to note in the equation that I wrote down the colors that we would expect to see right below our equation. Right, so you're also going to take note of that, and that a lab must also end with a conclusion, and the conclusion would be based on the aim of a lab. So in our lab, we wanted to separate a solution of copper 2 sulfate and water by simple distillation, and we wanted to obtain two substances, and we did, where we separated our mixture to obtain the water and the solid copper 2 sulfate.